Hi, Peter Ledermann of the Soundsmith here, and this video deals with stylus shape. Really interesting subject, and I hope this has some interest to you, a lot more than the UFO that's over my left shoulder. So, what are we dealing with? Well, we're dealing with a physical system, a stylus in a groove, to do an analog playback system. Rather challenging. I just want you to get an idea of what we're dealing with. This is the tip of a stylus, not anywhere near the entire stylus mass, and it's hooked up to an invisible cantilever, a huge arm, many times its size, hooked up to a suspension and generator, and good lord, that whole thing has to be moved accurately by that stylus, following the undulations in these groove walls. It's a system that shouldn't work at all, not nearly as well as it does. So we're happy for the miracle, but what we're here to talk about in these many videos by Soundsmith is how you can optimize this system. And I think if Thomas Edison were here and heard some of the wonderfully optimized analog systems based on his insightful invention, he'd be a little surprised that not only is it still around 100+ years later, but how well the system can work. It's always a miracle to me. So, stylus shapes. Well, there are two basic stylus shapes. You have the conical over here and some sort of fine line or elliptical or fine line over here. Notice the important thing here is that the contact line has lower contact area against the groove wall as compared to the fine line, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That has a bearing on azimuth that I talked about in another video. As you head from a conical to a contact line or a fine line stylus, you really want to get the azimuth right. You want it to fit in the groove properly. So how many different types of basic styli are there? Well, there are quite a few. You have everything from conical to elliptical to line contact, and some esoteric types like the microline. I don't want to talk about the microline too much. It was used a long time ago in the Shure V15. It's still used in some cartridges. And it's a very clever design because it has a ridge that stands out. And the beauty of the ridge is that it stays the same shape as it wears. The unfortunate thing is when it wears out at the end, it wears out very rapidly, and suddenly if you don't catch it, it can damage your records. It goes from being very good to terrible in a pretty short period of time. But again, the performance up till that point is wonderful. But it's not used very much. So let's talk about why there are different contact areas and contact shapes. The conical is easiest to make, it's cheapest. Then you have what are called ellipticals, and there are different qualities of ellipticals. You have a bonded elliptical, which is a diamond bonded to a steel pin. The reason that's done is it's surprisingly inexpensive to make. Then you have nude diamonds, where the entire diamond assembly, or stylus assembly rather, is pure diamond, and it weighs less, and mass is the enemy, so better performance. And there are various different types of elliptical shapes. You have simple ellipticals and up to hyper ellipticals, and then of course you have contact lines or fine lines. Why do you have these things? Well, here is the problem. Let's talk about the problem in a record groove. So here is a somewhat of an elliptical or hyperelliptical, let's say for the moment, compared to a contact line. You can imagine what a conical would do in this situation. The problem with a conical is that it won't fit into the valleys, if you will, of the groove wall. So what it does is it hops from mountaintop to mountaintop to mountaintop for the high frequencies. It can't fit in. And this problem is called a radius of curvature problem with styli. And as it gets towards the end of the record, where the modulations in the groove wall are twice as close together, that radius of curvature problem becomes even more severe. So to solve that, you go to fine line styli like this, which do a much better job of tracing in the valleys of the groove walls at high frequencies. So what are the problems? You say, well, if that's the way to do it, why doesn't everyone do it that way? Well, there are some problems. First of all, they're more expensive styli to make. They require a lot more trouble to make generally, depending on how they're made. Plus, the other thing is the alignment. With a fine line, you can't afford to have an azimuth problem, because if you don't have the azimuth aligned correctly, it's going to trace the wall really, really poorly. Whereas conical, you can have some azimuth misalignment, and all you're going to lose is some cartridge performance in terms of channel separation. It'll still trace the groove wall fairly well. Now let's get into some little more obscure things about shapes and how they affect how well the stylus can trace the record. So here's a really interesting chart, and I'm sort of doing this backwards, so I have to look at it backwards on my screen. But I want you to notice one thing of these various stylized shapes in the groove wall. And the thing I want you to notice, I can't read this backwards, it looks like contact area. You see what it says, contact surface. Okay, the contact surface. Please note that with a conical, I believe this is around 30, correct? So the contact area, notice, just don't worry about the scale, it just has the number 30. And notice as you get into the more esoteric shapes, it gets up to around 60. There's that, yeah, it's 62.1. Well, good Lord, that's twice the area in the groove wall, you can see it up there, as the conical. So what's the implication of that? Well, when you have a force between the diamond and the groove wall, you look at force over unit area. That's how much force, again, is over the area of contact. If you have twice the contact area, but you haven't changed the downward force, you have half the force per unit area. What does that mean? Well, if you don't press the stylus down into the groove as hard, it has a better chance of jittering, of not staying in good contact with the groove wall. So does that mean, in a very simplified way, that if I use a conical stylus at, pick a number, 1.5 grams, that if I have a fine line, I always have to use it at 3 grams? Yes and no. Yes in an absolute sense, but no in a real sense, because there are things that you can do to keep the cantilever and especially the stylus at the end of it in contact with the groove wall without having to double the tracking force. But the principle of what was just said is correct. It's more difficult to get a fine line stylus to stay in contact with the groove wall than in a sense it is the conical stylus, with the exception of how the conical traces the high frequencies, which it doesn't, which is why I'm a conical bigot. I don't think that term, those two words actually have been used together quite frequently, but I am a conical bigot. I don't like conicals. They're, I guess they're good to set up for people that really don't care, because they're easy, and the chances of you're getting it aligned are 100%. But you're not going to get the best performance. So if you're really interested in good analog performance, go to one of the better stylized designs. Now, there's something else that's a little bit more obscure, and I'll just talk about it briefly. When you trace more or less of the groove wall, you can statistically pick up more or less damage or dirt or debris in the groove. So in other words, here you're tracing a smaller percentage of the groove wall, so you actually kind of have a statistically lower chance of hitting some small dirt. Whereas when you trace more of the groove wall, you've got a much better chance of picking up some debris. So, or damage in the groove wall due to a partially damaged record. So a contact line is great if your records are in good shape and they're nice and clean, as they theoretically should be, but I've used my hyperelliptical stylus on certain records, and in our Carmen cartridge it uses a nude hyperelliptical, and it plays really nice and quietly on some records where a fine line may not be so happy. So sometimes this is why people have different cartridges with different styli. They may have 2 arms or even 3 or 4 arms on their turntable. One may be a mono cartridge, one may be a particular stylus shape, one may be a cartridge design that sounds different from others. We've set up a lot of turntables with our strain gauge cartridge on one arm and one of our moving iron or fixed coil cartridges on another arm. And again, sometimes people like to have different styli for different quality of records, how the records have been treated and cleaned, and the history of them. So again, not a real simple subject, but one that's terribly interesting and something that is wonderful to think about when you're buying a cartridge and you're looking at different Stylus designs. Thanks so much for listening. Peter Ledermann of Soundsmith.